Ladies and gentlemen, love isn't always about the fairy tale. Sometimes it's about falling apart, only to find each other again with deeper understanding and stronger hearts. Today, I want to share the story of a real couple, Sara and Ayaan. Their journey reminds us that love isn't just what survives the good times, it's what transforms through the hard ones. Sara and Ayaan met in college, one of those classic stories where friendship turned into something more. They were young, full of dreams, and deeply in love, but as time went on, life began to challenge them. Careers pulled them in different directions, expectations clashed, and the warmth between them slowly gave way to silence, to distance, to frustration. After 5 years together, they made the difficult decision to break up. For months, they didn't speak, but something unexpected happened during that silence. Instead of bitterness, reflection took over. Sara began therapy, trying to understand her own patterns and wounds. Ayaan started journaling, confronting the parts of himself he'd avoided for years. Slowly, they realized something profound. It wasn't love that had failed them, it was the way they were loving. They reconnected not with grand gestures, but honest conversations. No blame, no fantasy, just truth. In their interview, I asked them, what changed this time? Sara said, I stopped expecting him to read my mind. I learned to express what I feel even if it's messy. Ayaan added, I stopped trying to win arguments and started trying to understand her. That shift changed everything. Today, they are together again, not perfect, but present. They disagree, they cry, they laugh, but they never stop communicating. They've rebuilt, not the same relationship, but a better one, with respect, clarity, and mutual growth at its core. Their story isn't rare, but it is rarely told. In a world where breakups often signal the end, theirs is a powerful reminder. Sometimes two people need to fall apart to truly come back together, not as who they were, but as who they've become. This is not just a love story. It's a lesson in patience, healing, and choosing someone, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. When a relationship ends, it's easy to label it as a failure. But in many cases, a breakup isn't the final chapter. It's a pause, a mirror, a chance to reevaluate. For some couples, breaking up becomes the turning point that helps them rediscover not only each other, but also themselves. It's during the distance and silence that unresolved patterns, hidden wounds, and unspoken needs finally come to light. Being apart forces individuals to face themselves without the buffer of the relationship. It reveals the roles they played, the mistakes they repeated, and the truths they avoided. Rather than being a clean break, the separation becomes a messy but necessary confrontation with growth. For Sara and Ayaan, their breakup was painful, but it was also clarifying. Without the noise of constant arguments or suppressed emotions, they were able to reflect. They began to ask deeper questions, not just about the relationship, but about themselves. What were they bringing into the relationship? What old wounds were driving their reactions? What beliefs about love were holding them back? This period of self-inquiry became the groundwork for everything that followed. The space gave them perspective. It allowed them to see each other not through the lens of frustration or disappointment, but with empathy and distance. They realized that breaking up wasn't necessarily the sign that they didn't love each other anymore. It was a sign that the way they were loving wasn't sustainable. In that realization, something shifted. Not immediately, not perfectly, but slowly and meaningfully. The breakup that once felt like an ending began to take shape as a beginning. It became the catalyst that stripped away illusions and demanded something more authentic. When they came back together, it wasn't because they missed the comfort. It was because they had changed. Individual healing is often the missing piece when relationships fall apart. We tend to think that love alone will carry us through, but unresolved trauma, insecurities, and emotional baggage silently sabotage even the deepest connections. When Sara and Ayaan separated, they didn't rush to patch things up. Instead, they each turned inward, not out of anger but necessity. Sara began therapy, not to fix the relationship, but to understand why she often shut down during conflict, why she feared vulnerability, and why she struggled to communicate her needs without feeling guilty. Ayaan, on the other hand, started reading about emotional intelligence, journaling daily, and reflecting on why he defaulted to defensiveness and control when he felt unheard. This stage wasn't glamorous or dramatic. It was quiet, uncomfortable, and deeply personal. But in that silence, each of them discovered the roots of patterns they had carried for years, long before they ever met each other. They began to see how their upbringing, past relationships, and personal fears were influencing their choices and reactions. Healing gave them clarity. It helped Sara separate herself, worth from external validation. It helped Ayaan realize that love didn't mean always being right. It meant being open, even when it was hard. This individual work became the foundation for their second chance. They didn't return to the relationship expecting the other person to fill in their emotional gaps. They came back as whole individuals, more self-aware and emotionally equipped. That shift changed everything. The dynamic of the relationship evolved from dependency to mutual support, from blame to shared accountability. Without individual healing, their reunion would have been a repetition of the past. With it, they were finally ready to create something new, something based not on emotional neediness, but on mutual emotional readiness. One of the biggest turning points in any relationship is the moment both partners realize that assumptions are not communication. For Sara and Ayaan, unspoken expectations created a minefield of misunderstandings. Sara would often feel hurt when Ayaan didn't notice her emotional cues, expecting him to sense her moods without her having to explain. Ayaan, in turn, assumed that staying silent during conflict was better than saying something wrong, believing it was a form of keeping the peace. These assumptions slowly eroded their connection. They weren't fighting all the time, but they were drifting. Resentment built up not from the words they exchanged, but from the words they didn't. After the breakup, both began to understand the role these silent expectations had played in their downfall. When they eventually reconnected, communication became the first area they tackled. Not just talking more, but talking better. Sara started expressing her feelings without waiting for the perfect moment or fearing judgment. Ayaan began asking questions instead of making guesses. They learned how to listen, not to respond, but to understand. They practiced emotional honesty even when it was awkward or uncomfortable. They stopped trying to read each other's minds and started showing up with clarity and openness. This shift didn't eliminate conflict, but it changed the tone of their disagreements. They were no longer adversaries trying to win, but partners trying to understand. Communication became less about control and more about connection. They began using simple habits like check-ins, affirmations, and moments of gratitude to build a new language between them. What once felt like walking on eggshells slowly transformed into a space where they could be messy, real, and still feel safe. Assumptions had created distance. Clear communication started to rebuild the bridge between them, one honest conversation at a time. Growth in a relationship doesn't come from waiting for the other person to change. It happens when both individuals are willing to take responsibility for their role in the dynamic, even when it's uncomfortable. In the case of Sara and Ayaan, this was one of the hardest but most necessary realizations. During their time apart, both of them initially found it easy to point fingers. Sara thought Ayaan had been too controlling and emotionally distant. Ayaan believed Sara was too reactive and never satisfied. But as they sat with their thoughts, something shifted. Sara began to acknowledge how she often avoided conflict by shutting down emotionally, leaving Ayaan confused and disconnected. Ayaan started to understand how his need for control came from his own fear of rejection and vulnerability. This wasn't about blame, it was about ownership. They each started to take accountability not just for what went wrong, but for how they had responded to challenges in the relationship. This self-awareness laid the foundation for real change. When they came back together, apologies were not just surface level. They were rooted in genuine understanding and accountability. Sara didn't just say sorry for withdrawing. She explained why she had done it and what she was doing to grow. Ion didn't just admit to being emotionally closed. He shared how he was working on building trust and being more open. These moments of responsibility allowed them to meet each other without defensiveness. Growth began to show up in small but powerful ways. How they handled disagreements, how they asked for what they needed, and how they responded when old patterns started to resurface. They began seeing their relationship as a shared space where both had influence, both had impact, and both had the power to shift the energy when things went off track. Rebuilding love after a breakup doesn't happen through grand gestures or dramatic promises. It happens in the quiet consistency of showing up day after day with presence, patience, and maturity. When Sara and Ayaan decided to try again, they didn't fall back into old habits or chase the highs of infatuation. They chose to rebuild with intention, knowing that love isn't something that simply returns on its own. It's something that must be nurtured, especially after it has been broken. Presence became their anchor. They committed to being emotionally available, even during moments of tension or insecurity. That meant putting away distractions during conversations, being mindful of each other's emotional states, and resisting the urge to check out when things felt difficult. Patience followed closely behind. They accepted that rebuilding wouldn't be linear. Some days would feel like progress, others like setbacks. Old patterns didn't disappear overnight, and forgiveness wasn't a switch, it was a process. They gave each other space to grow at their own pace without pressure to be perfect. Maturity was the thread that held it all together. Both Sara and Ayaan began to approach the relationship not from a place of fear or neediness, but with grounded self-awareness. They understood that love isn't about avoiding conflict, but learning how to navigate it together. They let go of unrealistic expectations and embraced the reality that lasting love requires effort, emotional regulation, and a willingness to learn. They developed new routines, not just date nights or rituals, but emotional practices like weekly check-ins and intentional conversations about their needs. These acts of maturity allowed them to slowly build trust again, not because they promised it would never break, but because they were willing to keep repairing it together whenever it did.